Okay, welcome everyone, wherever you are. It's morning in London, but you know, in your respective time zones, it may be afternoon, it may be evening. So it's great here. I want to first of all thank again the organizers. I want to thank Henry and Jan for inviting me to give this talk. It's a real pleasure. I'm actually quite happy to do this. I'm really happy to do this because in my day-to-day activities, I'm now head of department, which is a management responsibility, and I don't have much time anymore to actually think and do scholarly work. So this is great, and I'm very happy also that this is a multidisciplinary event. This is something that I'm very fond of, and I hope to learn something from it. The important thing here for you to know is that I am coming to this topic and to this conference and to this webinar from the discipline of politics, broadly speaking. So I work in a department of politics and international studies that does not have a narrow understanding of political science, as you may find it in some parts of the United States, but a rather broad understanding of what the study of politics entails, you know, including open to sociology, anthropology, history, of course, theory, and so forth. Having said that, I am talking about the political and the politics of concept analysis. And this is something that for some of you may be quite trivial, but I think it is important to remind us of this. And so I hope that my presentation will be, if anything, just a refresher, but maybe also a provocative reminder for some who haven't really thought about concept analysis in terms of politics. I should also say that, as Jan noted, my own work encompasses paying attention and critically unpacking and analyzing the concepts of identity, power, security, peace, but also most recently friendship. And my latest interest, so to say, is in the practice of translation. So translation is something that I believe has not been looked at very much amongst scholars in politics. So I'm quite excited to see that there are quite a few of you are from the area of translation studies. And so again, that for me, hopefully generates some interesting questions as well. It's a new dimension for me that I'm really interested in. Okay. With that as a preface, let me start. I have about 13 slides. I hope I don't take up the entire half an hour because I'm really interested in hearing your questions. I do want to try to answer as many of them as I can. So let me go through my presentation. Let me start with something very basic, namely the purpose of concepts. What is the purpose of concept? Concepts name things. They delineate things, they give meaning to stuff. Now, by doing so, they also give us a language. So they give us a language to grasp different shapes in the world, to grasp events, to grasp relationships, action processes, and so forth. They give us categories to make sense of the world, yeah? And to provide these building blocks that we as analysts, as scholars need for our analytical narratives. So in that sense, concepts provide us an ontology, but they also help us with our epistemological question of trying to understand and see the world out there. Now, I want to start straight away by saying that because they have this purpose, this quite fundamental purpose of making the world known to us, they are political. Okay, and I think it's crucial to start with that understanding because sometimes we think about concepts simply as analytical tools rather than as political. And why political is precisely because they perform this function of making the world intelligible to us, of showing us what certain things mean, and by giving it a particular meaning rather than another. Also by blocking out some other aspects that the concept does not capture. Okay. So I think this notion of a concept as a political tool is really important. It isn't just a cognitive helper. It is deeply imbued with a political nature. Now, Concepts and their meaning often are thus understood as being commonsensical. This may not be for all of you listening, but if we go out into the world, if we listen to political discourse, if we talk to our neighbors and so forth, often those key terms, those concepts that we're using, they seem to be quite simple. They have a simple meaning. It's a meaning that we seem to all agree on. And why is that? It is either because we think that the concept represents something that is actually quite simple, or we think, no, we understand the reality is messy, but the concept actually creates a simple image of the world. So the very purpose of the concept is to reduce complexity and make reality appear simple. And then we often think that, these concepts that we use so often really have a common sense meaning that is widely shared and intuitive. And so we kind of use these terms, we use these concepts, or we see them being used without deeper reflection. Indeed, we can see that a concept is most appealing when the meaning is clear and when it can be associated with commons. But of course, we know that concepts are not simple or singular in meaning, but that they are complex and contested. Concepts bundle multiple elements, aspects, and experiences, and they contain unstable and multiple meanings. They can only be defined in quite vague and general ways. And as such, they're always open to interpretation and contestation. And here, in this very fact, that concepts contain multiple meanings, that they're unstable, that they're open to interpretation and contestation, here we see the nature of politics. So this is why concepts and analysis of concept, the use of concepts, is part of politics. And we should see the contestation as I would even say, core political understanding. I will come back to explain this in a bit more detail. Now, this is not something new, okay? So so far what I've said, I don't think should surprise anyone who has spent some time thinking about concepts. But if you're new to the subject, I would recommend to you to read one of the key scholars, and there are quite a few of them now, but Reinhard Koselleck, who was a German historian / sociologist / theorist, philosopher, a very influential person in the development of concept analysis. He coined this notion of a basic concept, and he basically said these basic concepts that are out there, such as democracy, the state, war, peace, these concepts play a central role in our social political language. And most importantly, we consider them irreplaceable. We cannot do without these concepts. We cannot do without these terms. Why and where do we see them? Because they are key terms that help us to grasp links between, but also to understand fundamental structures, processes, and events. They are key terms that are used by major social, economic, and political organizations and by movements. In other words, they're part of the political discourse. But they're also the key terms that are used in all the major theories and ideologies. So basic concepts permeate all these different layers, and as such, and this is very important, they function both as categories of political practice, in other words, as part of a political discourse, but they're also used by scholars to analyze the world. And that duality, the fact that basic concepts move in these two dimensions, that they're both central to the political social discourse out there, but they're also central to our work as analysts. That is and creates a fundamental tension in how we approach the analysis, and that brings us as analysts into the realm of politics, inevitably so, I would say. Now, I'm following here, Koselleck suggested, and he doesn't put it in this simple way, but basically a concept can be seen as having two fundamental dimensions, a basic concept, and that is on the one hand a temporal dimension. Now the temporal dimension basically tells us that a concept has a history, that it has a legacy, that it comes from somewhere, that it is the meaning that it carries is historically generated. But it also means that the temporal dimension has a strong forward-looking component. So a concept in that sense also has certain promises. It contains a potential. It contains an idea of what might be. If you take, for instance, the concept of sovereignty. Sovereignty is a concept that we use very often in the study of politics, especially international politics. And the concept of sovereignty has a history. We often refer to it as something that was born in Europe, in the Peace of Westphalia, and so forth and so forth. It is an idea, it is a concept with a history, with a very strong tradition and legacy. The meaning has changed over time, but it also has a promise. It has a promise to be sovereign. It is an aspiration. There is a hope in this concept that I want to be sovereign, and what that might be, that kind of almost utopian dimension of a concept. Now, and you can see already here the second dimension, namely the social political aspect of every basic concept. The concept helps us to organize social political life. It helps us to organize society, and it does so in the present. So whereas on the one hand, you have a temporal dimension with a history, with a future orientation, the social political function of the basic concept is that it plays out in our present reality, and it helps us to organize and understand that reality. The second key point is that concepts are always embedded in contexts. Now, again, this is quite trivial, but I think it is at the same time extremely important and really difficult to get your head around. Because what is a context? A context in itself is a very tricky concept. Okay, so I suggest, and this is maybe also quite intuitive, that you can break down contexts into 4 layers, if you want to put it that way. Yeah, your temporal layer. The temporal layer is already the one that I mentioned. It interlinks with the core, and the social political layer in which the concept is situated. It's its environment, the particular institutions, the kind of social norms in which a concept is placed and in which we study it. However, there are 2 more layers here that we need to take into account, and that is the theoretical and the material. You probably could even add a 5th layer, namely the emotional, but that is a fairly new, I think, area of research, and I haven't found a way to yet put it in there. So let me just mention the theoretical and the material. On the one hand, theoretically, and I'm also a theorist, and maybe I should say this up front, so I have a certain penchant for theory. You can see how concepts are embedded in and gain their meaning from a particular theoretical narrative. So if you take a very common concept such as power, you can see that in different theoretical traditions, in different theoretical narratives, power gains a different meaning. Okay, when you talk to, and let me just use these theories that we use in the study of international relations, you use a realist, or you use a liberal, or you use a feminist narrative. They all have the concept of power within their theoretical arguments, and yet the meaning of that concept is quite distinct. And that is because it is embedded in this particular theoretical framework system of meaning, and thus gains a different kind of meaning. Now, concepts, of course, are also embedded in and gain their meaning from a material environment. Okay, concepts are attached to or projected into material structures, architecture, material spaces, bodies. Yeah. If you take, for instance, the concept of sovereignty again, one of the most obvious material expressions of sovereignty is a border, a hard border, a territorial, or even law enforcement officers, the police, the military, that is there to protect the sovereign space, but also to act and perform the sovereign act of a government. So we need to understand that these concepts gain their meaning in different contextual layers, and how they're intertwined is extremely important, but also quite difficult to study. Now, I would argue that every concept analysis thus involves making choices. we need to make a choice about which concept, context, interaction we focus on. We cannot study all of this. It's unless we have 5 years time and we have an army of researchers and we have no coronavirus and no childcare and so forth and so forth. So we need to make choices about which concept, context, interaction we focus on, and we need to think about how we study this interaction very carefully. So our methodological approach here is something that isn't just given. There isn't just one way to do concept analysis. There are multiple ways. And that is directly linked to the question of why we engage in concept analysis in the first place. What is our motivation to do so? Now, I won't go into an article that I wrote, and it is also the first chapter of the edited volume that Jan briefly mentioned, where I basically distinguish between 3 different approaches: a historical, a scientific, and a critical approach. But I would like us to here briefly take a look at the critical approach because it teases out the political nature of concept analysis. So the critical approach basically takes as a starting point the view that concepts are meaning-making forces. They make meaning. We don't just use them as analysts to understand the world, but they make the world. They give the world meaning. And I use a quote here from Michel Foucault. We can think about concepts as practices that systematically form the objects of which they speak. So this really is a focus on the productive power of a concept in 2 ways. And I think it's quite important because power itself, of course, is a basic concept. So you have to break it down. And I think the most simplest way is to think about power in 2 ways. Power to the productive power of a concept to make us see the world in a particular way, but also to make the world. So it has a productive function, not simply a cognitive function of make us see clearly. It actually produces something. But the critical approach also emphasizes the power over nature of this meaning making, namely that it doesn't just create meaning, it also has power over the meanings that are out there by highlighting some and by downplaying others. In other words, it selects a particular meaning. Yeah. As I said earlier, the way we think about, for instance, sovereignty can change dramatically. And the way we think about over time and space, depending on who you talk to. So the way we think about sovereignty, the meaning of sovereignty, automatically also then creates a particular organizing society. And thus, it also has an effect of how we organize the lives of others. So understanding the political power of a concept in not just understanding the world, but organizing the world and affecting how others live is extremely important. And the critical approach highlights that. So thus, the objective of this critical approach is to study the meaning of concepts, the meaning-making force of concepts, and especially not only how they make meaning, but how this meaning is controlled and how it's contested. And what the aim is then is to destabilize this kind of commonsensical understanding, the taken for granted knowledge, and reveal its contingency, but also reveal the silences that it doesn't capture, and open the door for alternatives in thought and action. Now, this is a fairly well-known objective of any critical approach, but why is this important in this context that when we think about concept analysis? Because it puts at the forefront the recognition that the analyst is participating in this production. The analyst is also a meaning maker. Okay. Let me give you an example. So one of the core concepts, or if we use Koselleck's terminology, basic concepts is security. We all use the notion of security. Politicians love it. Right now in the pandemic that you would argue is primarily a health crisis, an economic crisis. Even that is couched in the language of security. The concept of security plays a fundamental role in social political discourse and in our lives. whether on the individual level, whether on the state level, whether on the global level. We use the notion of security all the time, and it has a particular effect. Now, scholarship that looks critically at this use of the concept of security does what we call the study of moves of securitization, turning something into a security problem or into a security object. So it understands this as a fundamentally political act. Now, this political act has a temporal and a social political dimension, right? It has a temporal dimension in the sense that it creates a sense of threat that is experienced, that we know comes from somewhere, and we expect this to happen in the future. It has a referent object that is the thing that has to be secured. In other words, it contains the notion of something that we think is under threat. Okay, so this notion of a referent object and of a threat are the two central components of the concept of security, and as a key to the securitization discourse. Now, what do we do when we analyze the referent object here? Is it a human? Is it the state? Is it the globe? What kind of security are we talking about? Whose security are we talking about? But it is the threat that we need to focus on, because the threat is the thing that we need to respond to. So the threat in every security discourse and every notion of security has within it an understanding that there is a somewhere. And the meaning of the threat is directly linked with the meaning of the referent object. We need to take a careful look at those two, because they give us, I wouldn't say determine, but they give us a rationale for how to respond to protect the referent object from this particular threat. And so what critical approaches do is they look at the effects of a particular referent object, of a particular threat, and try to look at how does this set the agenda for politicians? How does this lead them to invest in certain resources? How do they silence opposition? So all these political effects are being studied very carefully, and they look at how the notion of the referent object and the threat and the effects of our portrayal or representation of these concepts, how they're manifested in different layers of society, the materiality of the response, but also, of course, the ideational dimension, the idea of a threat in the end. It's an imagination, right? It isn't here yet. It is something that we imagine to happen. So there's a strong ideational dimension. And yet there's also a deep emotional dimension, in the sense that a threat also is creating fear. And so analyzing this critically, breaking down this concept of security, these securitization moves into these different elements, and understanding their effect on politics and the political response is methodologically quite demanding. Especially if you remember, if we look at this across multiple contextual layers. Now, there's one key problem, however, that the literature and those who have done this work, and there's a lot of work done on this in international relations. The question is, are we simply observing and recording what is happening? Are we simply observing when a certain political actor, a certain government declares something a security issue and says, this is our threat. This is a threat to national security, and this is what we have to do. And so are we simply observing, recording this, critically examining it, critically examining the response? Or are we also reproducing this very discourse, this very conceptual understanding of security by analyzing it? In other words, is the analysis reaffirming the reality that this concept produces? Does it push the meaning further, or does it actually change it? Does it undermine it? And this poses a fundamental question, and scholars have asked this fundamental question that is, you find in a lot of critical literature. What's the ethical responsibility of the researcher, of the analyst, in revealing a politically very powerful concept and meaning, and how it works? Because you're not just observing and recording it, you're revealing something. And by revealing this, you are also showing how something works and the political effects it has, which can be used by political actors, not simply for purposes of knowledge creation, but for purposes of governance. Okay, so there's a fundamental question on the participation of the analyst here in the production of the security discourse and the responsibility of what the findings say and the implications this might have, the repercussions. So the problem really is, I would say, not only that the critical approach is finding this quite hard to both critically examine something and distance itself from it, but I think it's also problematic to actually label the critical approach as something that is distinct from other forms of concept analysis. Because what that does, it absolves other approaches from a reflexive engagement with concept analysis. And it does not really push them to ask the question, what is the analyst as a meaning maker? And so this article that I mentioned previously, where I distinguished for analytical reasons, heuristic reasons, between these three approaches, the critical or political, the scientific, and the historical, I think that is a very useful distinction. And yet it is also problematic, because it suggests that there's only one approach in which we need to have this critical attitude, in which we need to be attuned to the political power of concepts, and the other two don't really need to do that. They have different purposes, and they don't really need to think about the effects. Now, I think this is a problem, because every analysis of basic concepts engages in deconstruction. We deconstruct the concept, we open it up, but we also reconstruct it. We deconstruct it in a particular context, but we also reconstruct its meaning. And secondly, every concept analysis must deal, especially when we look at core or basic concepts, must deal with the fact that they're functioning both as a category of analysis and a category of political practice. Yeah. In other words, if I look at the concept of security, how it is used in political discourse, I also cannot disconnect myself from the fact that I, as a researcher, have a particular understanding of what security is or should be. How do we deal with this interaction is a fundamental challenge. And I do not think that concept analysts have always really thought that through, because it is quite tricky. The implications are quite tricky, because it asks fundamentally about, are we participants in this political discourse? So how are we to deal with this? And these are just some simple thoughts. First of all, I think analysts shouldn't see themselves as truth seekers, but as translators. That might please some of you who work in translation studies. I think it would be quite new for some of my colleagues in political science. But what that means is, in particular, that we need to be clear about our motivation for and our approach to concept analysis. We need to be very clear about our reading of the core of a particular concept, of its temporal dimension and its social political function. We need to be very clear about our choices of the contexts without succumbing to those contexts, without giving them the power to define, pretending that we stand outside. But we also need to be very clear about how we deal with the deconstructive and reconstructive move, and that we own these moves. And finally, we need to reflect on how our findings shift or affirm the analytical and political vocabulary of our times, and we need to think about the implications. And with this, I will stop, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.